Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking with a Tibetan Lama who trains counselors in ways of working with people who are dying. Sogyal Rimpoche is considered an authority of what is known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He was raised in a monastery in Tibet, studied comparative religion and philosophy at Cambridge University in England. He has lived in the West for 10 years, and for the last 5 years he's been teaching on the subjects of death and dying, psychotherapy, and healing, and he's exploring ways of integrating traditional Eastern perspectives into hospice care in Western medical settings. What is a Lama, and what does Rinpoche mean?
Lama, if you say it briefly, it's a spiritual teacher. It's a title or honor given to a Buddhist priest of Tibet or Mongolia. And Rinpoche is also a title given to an incarnate Lama. For example, in the Buddhist tradition of Tibet, we have a system of choosing teachers, reincarnations, and they are known as tulkos. But the honor that is given is Rinpoche, which means the precious one.
Does one aspire to those titles? As a boy, did you grow up saying, I hope I become a Lama, I hope I become Rinpoche?
No, it became just automatically conferred upon me. But then as my training developed, you were not known as a Rinpoche straight away. As your training developed, then you came to be known with that title.
What is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and why are Tibetans so interested in death?
Well, in the Buddhist teachings, especially in the Tibetan tradition, that the life and death are seen as a part of a whole. We cannot live without the real understanding of death, meaning we live truly without understanding. So that the death formed a very integral part of the teaching. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks not only on the area of death, but speaks about how we can understand the nature of death in life and how we can actually gain confidence at the moment of death, how we come to prepare for death. For example, we call the small deaths or the living links of death in life are the changes. When we work through that, we can gain the confidence and the surety. And so that the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches really how to understand our mind, how to understand the mind, and particularly our projections, because at the moment of death, when a physical world and all those references, protection that we have, that we call our model world, falls apart, our true mind and its projections is kind of loose in the sky, like one is just floating in the space, one is just mind and its projections. And if one does not know one's mind and its projections truly, then it's rather frightening or can cause confusion. Whereas if one has worked with that, it could be a source of enlightenment as well as understanding and realization and good report.
When you talked about the little deaths and changes, there was a kind of a smile that came on your face, I felt that you were discussing something that was very positive.
Yes.
To you.
In fact, many people misunderstand death as a kind of a very morbid sense of humor when you start discussing death. But in actual fact, when you really truly understand death in life through changes, which are its living links, if you understand that, then one gains the humor of life. The things no longer becoming so serious. One begins to realize the importance one attached to events and situations become more light-hearted.
Can people who have been raised in the Western tradition in the United States and have grown up with a fear of death, can they really ever appreciate what you're saying?
I think they can if they come to face the fear. A lot of the time the fear comes from fearing the fear. If one were to kind of slowly court one's own feelings, because I think a lot of the times we are afraid to confront it. And I think to confront the fear of death rather more kind of harshly is not good. To just do it very quietly. For example, if you're hanging out with a friend and just talking in the moment of intimacy and when you feel well, if you went out all your fears about death and so forth, that even though there may be fears, because you have that intimacy of situation, it seems much easier. And once you're able to express, one even understands one is able to look at face with one's fear, and they're not so terrible.
Is that what people do in Tibet? Do Buddhists in Tibet sit around when they're hanging out with a friend and talk about death?
Well, they do talk about death also, but from the Buddhist point of view, from very young age, for example, in my training as a Lama, one of the first things you really come to realize is that the death is as much as a part of life as life is. And as you begin to really look into the impermanence in death, as Buddha himself said, of all mindfulness and of all awareness, the mindfulness and awareness of impermanence in death is important. As you begin to take that as a part of you, begin to look at it as your reference point, or begin to look at it as like the mirror in which you really check your life and see whether everything is in order or not.
Mm-hmm.
And when you begin to look at that, it really begins to teach you how to lead a more meaningful life. So in some sense, the death has a life-enhancing quality. And I feel sometimes that until one really realizes the inevitability of death, or begins to accept changes and impermanence of life, that one simply merely exists. That when one is really trying to confront with death, one begins to live. And the interesting factor is that in the West, for example, people are a little bit skeptical about all these spiritual things, but recently there have been very extraordinary phenomena, what is called the near-death experiences. And it seems in America alone, in the United States alone, there are 8 million people who have gone through this experience. And these people, having gone through the experience, which could maybe last only for a few minutes, but after that their total vision and outlook changes. Previously maybe they're more schedule oriented, maybe they're more into kind of life, so-called life, I put in quotes, life.
Mm-hmm.
But now they become more concerned about the finer meanings of life, about looking into themselves. Because what I find is sometimes when we look into life, life distracts you into the triviality of things, that you go farther away from life than seemingly in life. Though you are actually working for life, you go further away. So death is always bring you back to yourself. So from a Buddhist perspective, when you think of death or impermanence every day, meaning you look into yourself every day and to see where the hell you're going wrong or right.
Okay. Does that mean that you look forward to death? Do you wake up and say, maybe today is the day?
No, not that. I'm not that morbid. But I think it's more of if you're ready every day, if you live a good life, a complete life every day, then when death comes, you're prepared.
Does the attitude that we have, which is different, now you have talked about a Buddhist perspective of death in Tibet, and we've talked a little bit about the fear of death that we have traditionally associated with people in the West. Does that have anything to do with life expectancy? Do Tibetans live longer or shorter than Americans?
I don't think that has not so much to do with that, I don't think so. I don't think so.
We do read stories in places in Mongolia and Tibet where people live to extremely long ages,
that is also
which doesn't
true.
seem to be very common in this country.
That is very true. There are cases where people lived 108 years and 110 years and so forth. I think if one were to look really philosophically deeply, in some ways when one really accepts death, which in many ways represents for us, those who are alive, represents something deeper than death itself. It represents acceptance. It represents facing yourself. It represents forgiveness. It represents completely revealing all your dark side and really becoming a clean person in a good sense. I don't mean in a puritanic way.
Mm-hmm.
And so once one does that, the healing process begins. There is more humor, there is more joy. For example, if you know that everything is impermanent, and if you really know that deep into your heart, in some ways you can enjoy things much better. There's not the emotional investment, that too much hope that you have in things, which inevitably causes disappointment. And that when something happens and you don't, it doesn't work out, you can just say, well, c'est la vie, as the French people say, it's life.
You have what we might call a belly laugh. You have exuberance and enjoy. You are celebrating life at this time as we do this discussion.
We're talking about death.
Where we're talking about death. The people in Great Britain, where you were formally educated for a part of your life, are very subtle in their humor. There aren't very many Britons that have loud, boisterous belly laughs that really kind of let it all out. Are they closer to the Tibetan or the Europeans, the French people? You use the French language.
I think
Where are they in the whole scheme of things?
You mean the Europeans?
The Europeans.
Europeans are very difficult to say, to kind of categorize them generally. The English are extremely different from the French. I live in those two countries primarily. I work also in Holland and Italy. They're very different too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if I were to kind of map out the Americans as well as the Europeans together, is that I would find that in America there's a kind of a crazy energy, which is good, which could produce the possibility of like belly laugh,
Mm-hmm.
but also belly ache. That kind of could be a neurotic craziness. At the same time, can be a really abandoning, freeing craziness. Whereas in English, people are more subtler. They are more kind of, in some sense, tolerant and open, kind of less crazy and more upper step lip, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, there is something very nice about them, that they're very kind of open. They're very kind of consistent. And that is a wonderful thing about them. The French are more emotional, and so that I think if you work with the heart more, it is wonderful asset that they have.
What is a bardo?
Pardo is a transition. Para in Tibetan means in between, do is thrown. It's a transition between two lives. And generally speaking, we call the period after you die and before you take on a new birth is called a pardo, or the intermediary state. But in actual fact, in the Tibetan teachings, we speak of there are 6 parados, being 3 in life and 3 in death. 3 in life are more from the moment we are born till we die, as one big period of transition. And it's interesting, it's seen as a transition, therefore not permanent. For example, the term for the body in Tibetan is lu, which means something that has to be left behind, like an hotel inn to the room which you don't get attached because it's a temporary residence only. And then another is the sleep and dream state. That is another reality. And the third is the meditative or the alter state of being. And that is of life. And in the death is from the moment when you die, when the dissolution of elements take place, when death as such take place. And then the next is when the death has happened, and when your true nature mind is freed from this limitations of life. And when it's released and when we experience what we call the inner luminosity, when you experience the nature of mind, that is the second state of Pardo. And the third is when you roam in what is known as the actual Pardo, before you take on a new birth. So the 3 Parados of life, of death. So that's consisting of 6. And these 6 are really the teachings in the Buddhist teachings or the Tibetan teachings are aimed at how we can gain the understanding of the nature of mind in all these different situations. That is to say, if you work with these teachings, you might gain enlightenment or understanding of your mind in this life. If not, maybe sleep and dream you are more appropriate for you. Maybe meditative state may be more conducive for you. Then maybe if you fail in that at the moment of death, if you fail in that, maybe you see the light. If you fail in that, maybe you choose a good birth.
How long in Earth time do the stages of Pardo last?
Earth time, the stages of the, here we are talking about the Pardo, that is to say, the Pardo after death. Of course, the life we know.
Sure.
Generally speaking, according to the Tibetan teachings, it is 49 days after you die and before you take on a new form, so to speak. But that is again only a general thing. Depending on the kind of person one is, it could vary a great deal. Some cases it is said 21 days. That is why in the Buddhist teachings, when someone has died within the 21 period of death, that great care is taken, practice is done, and the spiritual teachers invited so as to help that dead person because it is the period where his future is being formulated.
How do you go about helping a dead person work out their future?
Well, I think first is to very simple things to just to give love. Give love and give attention and care. That's what we want in life too, care and love. And if you're able to put out that in a kind of unconditional way, in a really loving and compassionate way, if you're able to put out that, in that space of love and compassion, the dying person can relax, feel that strength. And especially in love, when the love is really communicated in a kind of a wonderful way, there is a kind of a confidence that the dying person receives from that. Even though he or she may be dying, because the love seems to be so eternal, kind of thing, he or she finds strength from that. That is the first thing, is the love that could also help the person to kind of die in an easy way, or like the pain of death can be eased through love, through the loving care. And then the spiritual aspect is very important, because that really gives the hope for the future, or like the understanding of what death is. So these two are the most important, crucial areas in the helping someone who's dying.
Is that achieved through praying for this person after the moment of death?
There are many ways of doing it. A simple thing is just praying with a very open heart, with really truly thinking for the sake of the person, and then just praying wherever. Sometimes we pray to God, but sometimes we don't understand exactly the nature of God, but just within trust you pray. According to the Buddhist tradition, we speak of praying to the Buddha, who represents that, the Buddha principle, or the enlightened principle, which is in all of us.
I know there's someone listening right now who believes that when they die, that is the end of their life. Will anything different happen to that individual than to someone who has the philosophy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead?
I think it doesn't really matter as regard their belief at all. Sometimes truth is not according to belief. I mean, sometimes I say to people who do not believe that there's no life after, I tell them, what if you die and you find there is a life after?
You've talked about near-death experiences and how many there have been in this country. How do those near-death experiences and the documentation of them stack up against the documentation in the Book of the Dead?
Oh, very much so. For example, when the first book by a doctor called Moody, who wrote the book called Life After Life, it seemed to substantiate quite a great deal to the Tibetan teachings. Now, since that time, even that research has been deepened and gone deeper. And recently I had a major conference I shared with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is one of the leading figures in that death and dying field, and Dr. Kenneth Ring, who is an amazing, wonderful man who is continuing the work of Moody, and he has run some work, and I had discussions with him, and it seemed to, when you go really deeply into those researches and deepen, they seem to really speak the same language as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but in a kind of even fresher way.
We talked a little bit about reincarnation. When we talk about reincarnation in the United States, we talk about believing in reincarnation. And yet in other parts of the world, in other traditions, people don't talk about believing in reincarnation. They accept it as a fact of life, as a
I think sometimes when you start, like in America, if you start just believing in a reincarnation, it's more on the basis of like an investment. You make, if everything goes wrong, you don't really, your heart is not, you just believe.
Just covering your bases.
Interesting, the word is believe. But the main premises of this, for example, I appeared on the French television, and I did a big discussion on death, and what I find that the people seem to miss the main point about reincarnation, for that matter life after, is very much with this life. As Buddha said, what you are is what you have been in the past, what you've done. What you will be is what you do now. So that the future is dependent upon what you do now. So that the whole principle of the reincarnation is depending upon how we live now, how we kind of free the goodness, the fundamental goodness, the soft spot the love, the compassion that we have, how we kind of free ourselves. Like a lot of the times we want to love, we want to free that, but we have the feeling of vulnerability and, to be hurt and to close. So how we have managed to overcome those difficult periods and difficult things, and how we are able to open and to really believe, and here the belief is believe in the goodness, or actually generate the goodness. Just as when the clouds go away, the sky is true, the sun is true, the sunshine is true, that kind of goodness. And that goodness really is the fundamental thing, goodness in human being. As one great Tibetan master said, even the most wildest beasts, they show their love to the young one, show that the Buddha nature, or that compassion of Buddha nature, is in everyone. So that love and the compassion that is in everyone, that has to be really believed or worked on, because that is what survives death, and that is what matters after death.
If my frame of reference is Western, if my view of reality is Western, can I embrace a Buddhist perspective on death?
Well, yes. I don't think the Buddhist perspective doesn't necessarily only works in a kind of Tibetan setting or in a Indian setting. Not at all. The teaching of Buddha is universal, and what the main message of the Buddha is I think the greatest message of the Buddha is that his enlightenment, which is to show that an individual, a human being, can actually awaken and become enlightened. It is possible. The greatest message of Buddha is that it is possible. You can do it. There's a tremendous hope in that. And since that time, Buddha actually shared his way of how he became enlightened. This was shared through to his disciples, many of them who later onwards some became fully enlightened, either somewhat. And to this day, there's a kind of a living kind of proof of that possibility. So that possibility is not something that is limited to just Tibetans or Indians, but it's universal. And as the Buddhist teachings come here to the West, it is becoming more Western than anything else. It becoming very much, it addresses the heart of the people. What is amazing when I go on teaching from country to country, both in Europe and here, that many of the teachings that Buddha speaks on addresses to the heart of what people have experienced. When they get that personal confirmation, or like a personal truth comes out of it, there's a tremendous feeling of joy of becoming reunited with what they have previously been seeking. So that's why in Tibetan in Buddhism, the word is interesting word for wisdom is to rediscover something that you know from before, but you have temporarily forgotten.
Is meditation the gateway to
Yes.
enlightenment?
Meditation is the key, is the initial way of first clearing the mind. Like first what you do is you just calm the mind so that the confusion can dissipate. When there's no confusion, there's more clarity and insight.
Do people who meditate a lot know when they're going to die?
Yes. I think it's very important to know here in the West that just to meditate, just to sit and meditate a lot, meaning just to sit a lot, doesn't really work. There is a little bit more to it than that. Is just practicing is not enough. How you apply that to your life, into the actual fabrics of your life, how you're able to apply that. That really makes the difference. For example, when you meditate, first, meditation is just a practice. So you practice so that you may gain the perfection. Like for example, after you've done some meditation, your mind is calmer, more mindful, more peaceful, less ego. So if you apply that mindfulness to your, maybe within the calm surroundings of your home, maybe you go everything, maybe when you clean the floor, you do it compassionately. When you wash dishes, you think you're cleaning your mind. And it'll be maybe more fun washing dishes that way.
The dishes might get cleaner,
Yeah,
too.
cleaner also, yes, true. And there's more kind of love even to the dishes and even to the dirt.
Mhm.
And when you do that, there is a sense of peace and kind of a sense of compassion, even with the dishes. As that comes, then maybe you can go to life and, slowly try to apply that mindfulness. If you do so, maybe the bosses will like you better. The work will be much better. Your energy is better. You feel less tired. If you're able to apply that mindfulness as often as possible, sometimes we may forget it, that's fine. But from time to time, if we can remind ourselves of that mindfulness that we arrive at meditation in everyday life, then slowly, slowly, the difference between meditation and life falls down. And then it is said that though a meditator may leave meditation, meditation will not leave the meditator. Meaning that life become meditation. Then it is not meditation, it is non-meditation. It's just effortlessly being, humorously and compassionately. When that kind of confidence is gained, then one can face death. Because then through that process, one is slowly able to see one's mind also, through the insight and clarity and the wisdom that you gain through the practice of meditation.
If I try to apply this philosophy, and I take a compassionate attitude toward the things and the animals and the elements and the people around me.
Also the work.
And the work around me.
True.
And I am somewhat successful, and I meditate. And now I'm faced with death, and I know I'm going to die. I'll go to the doctor, and he says, you have 1 week to live. What should I do to prepare for death as an individual?
In such a case, perhaps because you've done so in your life, automatically there's something more you have than otherwise. I mean, you will know it by that time. Then you will be, in fact, you may perhaps panic less. You might try to really, I think, make the best of the life you have week to live. Because in some sense, when we come to face with death, it's not so much waiting for the death to happen, but to live life that you have now fully so that you will be ready. Like you notice that in 1 week you have to go, so you start packing your bag now.
What about for the individual, if you were to come across someone in your travels that had just been hit by an automobile, and you could tell that they had very severe physical injuries, they had consciousness, and they were about to die? Is there some way that you can help that individual?
Well, in such a case, that's a very good question. In such a case is that I would just go there and maybe just touch the person and just try to send my practice to the person. That is to say, I might meditate and try to send my kind of compassion or that blessing. And then even more so is to visualize, for example, a presence of the Buddha above that dying or that very ill person, and ask him to purify all maybe the negativity, impurities, and ask to receive if he's going to die, receive his consciousness or mind or soul into his being. That kind of the blessing of light is a very important one. We do that, and it's amazingly, I've done this several times in hospitals and cases, and seem to help.
Is death a very different sort of experience for other creatures other than human beings?
I think perhaps since human beings are more awake, more conscious, so death comes as more consciously to us than perhaps to the other beings. Very much so. And another word to add to is that, for example, with compassion and with this attitude, if you apply to life, not only will it help you at the moment of death, but perhaps also relieves the tension that inflict us in life also.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.